Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Bitter Pill. I'm your host, Jeff Melton. So, today I wanted to talk about a recent. Why am I getting an echo? Sorry about that. I had the YouTube feed on, so I was getting an echo of what I was saying. Um, anyway, so as I was saying, today I wanted to talk about a recent statement by Jill Stein's campaign where she listed a bunch of Western war criminals or alleged war criminals, as well as um, Vladimir Putin and Bashar al-Assad, the presidents of Russia and Syria, respectively. So she got a lot of pushback for this statement, which was issued in the aftermath of an interview with Mehdi Hasan of Ziteo News Network, his own independent outlet, who used to be a commentator for MSNBC, and as you might expect, um, a total shill for the Democratic Party, even though, unlike the overwhelming majority of prominent Democrats, is pro-Palestinian and anti-Israel's genocide. But nonetheless, he kind of toes the Democratic Party line on most other issues. So anyway, um, let's have a look at the statement, and then we will analyze it, or I will. And you are certainly free to include your own thoughts in the comments. Okay, so here's Jill Stein's post uh, on X with an introduction to her statement. And let me just go through the highlights of the statement, which was published on September 19th. So if you go to Jill Stein's, well, I'll just put the link in the comments if you want to follow along with me on your own, although I am going to read through it. Okay, there it is. So let's have a look. Okay, so her introduction to the statement is we condemn all war criminals, including Benjamin Netanyahu, Vladimir Putin, Bashar al Assad, and a long list of names of U.S. presidents and vice presidents, and many more. We also recognize the urgent need for diplomacy to prevent World War III. Okay, I can't disagree with that last statement. But let's have a look at this statement and um, you tell me what you think, but I thought that it was problematic in a lot of ways. So she or her campaign staff, uh, with her approval, of course, said after a recent interview, which did not provide the opportunity for a nuanced and serious discussion of important and controversial topics, and I don't know why they didn't say who the interview was with, but it was with Mehdi Hasan, as I said. And the reason why it didn't provide the opportunity for nuanced and serious discussion of important and controversial topics is that Mehdi Hasan is, I mean, he's a little more to the left politically, I guess, but especially on Israel Palestine. But he reminds me a lot of Piers Morgan in terms of his tendency to constantly talk over guests and berate them and badger them, which he did here, which is the reason why they didn't have the opportunity for a nuanced and serious discussion. Anyway, after that interview, we want to take this opportunity to clarify our stance on key issues, particularly any misunderstandings regarding our comments about Vladimir Putin and Bashar al-Assad. So, why the focus on these two? Well, I mean, they were, Hasan badgered Jill Stein to condemn these two individuals as war criminals, and she did so. So I don't understand the reason for the statements, but we'll get into claims about Putin's and Assad's alleged war crimes in a moment. But anyway, our campaign condemns both Putin and Assad as war criminals responsible for immense suffering and devastation. Putin's military intervention in Syria, supporting Assad's brutal suppression of the Syrian people's uprising, is a stark example of his disregard for human rights. Okay, well, let's go. I'll go ahead and address this claim about the reason why Putin intervened, and about Assad. Now, I will admit I'm not as knowledgeable about events during the war in Syria over the last 12 years as I am about events in Ukraine, which I'll talk about in more detail. But suffice it to say that the notion that Assad is just a brutal dictator, as Tulsi Gabbard called him when she was confronted about her opposition to U.S. intervention in Syria. This claim is, the standard Western propaganda view. That doesn't necessarily mean that Assad hasn't committed war crimes or crimes in general. There are credible allegations that his government has engaged in torture of political opposition at times. There are various other claims that Western media and politicians have made that there isn't much evidence for, and I'll get into that. But this notion that there was this popular uprising in Syria, and Assad brutally suppressed it, and that's all there is to the matter. I mean, you complain, Jill and staff, that you didn't have the opportunity for nuanced and serious discussion during the interview with Mehdi Hasan that Jill and her running mate Bruce Ware did. And yet this statement completely lacks nuance or serious, detailed discussion. Because, I mean, the context that needs to be in this statement, as far as Syria is concerned, is that there was a U.S.-backed effort starting in 2011 to overthrow the Syrian government, to overthrow Bashar al-Assad's government. So if you recall, in 2011, there was the so-called Arab Spring throughout many Arab and North African countries, Middle Eastern and West Asian and North African countries. And there's a lot of evidence, which I don't have time to get into detail on in this video, that there was heavy U.S. involvement in this so-called Arab Spring. That on one hand, there's an element of popular opposition, in various countries. Egypt, for example, there was a mass movement for greater democracy in many of these countries, but there was also covert Western intervention in all of these cases, and you know, especially in Syria, where um, affiliates of Al Qaeda and um, ISIS were among the forces that the U.S. was backing in Syria, whose objective was not to um, promote reforms in Syria or something like that, but to overthrow the Syrian government and replace it with, a very reactionary Islamic regime of their own. Whereas, if you know anything about Syria, you know that whatever you may think overall of the Syrian government, one thing you can say is that there's religious freedom there. It's a secular country. Um, there are a whole bunch of different religions practiced: Christianity, every sect of Islam you can imagine, and so forth, and lots of people who aren't religious, and it's a secular regime where religious freedom is protected. Obviously, quite unlike most of the uh, governments in the region. Um, but yeah, the U.S. Had as its objective, overthrowing Assad's government, and to that end, the U.S. and its allies in the region, Saudi Arabia and Qatar and so forth, um, Turkey, intervened in Syria. There are still today in 2024 U.S. troops, occupying uh, I believe it's the northeast corner of Syria, something like a quarter of its territory, and it just so happens, not accidentally, that this is a region where most of Syria's oil is, like most uh, West Asian countries. Syria has very large oil reserves, and also where its main farmland is. So the U.S. is sitting there along with various other forces that are hostile to the Syrian government, preventing them from taking advantage of those resources. But in any case, um, this is kind of, I guess you could say, the tail end, hopefully, of a very long war that's been going on in Syria. I mean, it's often characterized, or typically characterized in the West, as a civil war, but it's hard to say it's a civil war when there's so much foreign intervention in Syria. So, why was Russia in Syria? It's kind of strange to say Putin's military intervention in Syria. It's Russia's military intervention in Syria. But anyway, the reason Putin, or rather the Russian military, intervened in Syria is because the Syrian government asked them to, because the uh, Islamo-fascist forces, al-Nusra, et cetera, were 12 kilometers from Damascus. They were about on the verge of overthrowing the Syrian government. So Assad asked for Russia's help in defending Syria. So that's why, uh, that's the reason for quote unquote Putin's military intervention in Syria. And not to support Assad's brutal suppression of some sort of um, pro-democracy popular uprising, but to prevent an anti-democratic force, much more so than Assad, uh, from taking over and you know killing all their uh, political opponents, taking away their rights to practice their religion freely, and so on and so forth. That's the reason why Assad asked Russia to intervene in Syria. There was an ulterior motive for Russia. And they happened to, because Russia's had close ties with Syria going way back into the days of the Soviet Union, and Russia has a naval base in Syria. One of only 2 naval bases they have, the other being in Crimea, which traditionally has been part of Russia or part of the Soviet Union. Then for a brief period of about between 15 and 20 years, it was part of Ukraine. And in 2014, by virtue of a popular referendum in Crimea, Crimea joined Russia. The population overwhelmingly voted to secede from Ukraine and join Russia. And the reason why they did that is that in 2014, there was a U.S.-backed coup, a very violent, bloody coup in Ukraine that brought to power a very far-right government, which included a lot of literal Nazis, and the military as well. In fact, nowadays, the outright Nazis or neo-fascists, Banderas are more in the military than in the government because they haven't done so well in elections. But nonetheless, they very much have a lot of power in Ukraine. And so one of the characteristics of Nazis, one of the groups of people they hate, I should say more specifically, is Russians. And there are a lot of ethnic Russians in Ukraine. So that government engaged in all sorts of repression against its ethnic Russian population. Wouldn't allow them to teach the Russian language in schools, prevented them from teaching history that they regarded as pro-Russia or pro-Soviet. Engaged in brutal repression against, really anybody who dissented from their government, but particularly ethnic Russians who are predominantly in eastern areas of Ukraine, such as Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk. Prior to 2014, the easternmost provinces, or oblasts as they call them there, in Ukraine. Now they're all part of Russia, as are a couple of other Ukrainian provinces, having voted by popular referendum. Extensively observed by international observers, much like the recent Venezuelan election, where people overwhelmingly voted to leave Ukraine and join Russia. Back to the statement. As advocates of peace and human rights, we condemn all war criminals, including Vladimir Putin, Bashar al-Assad. And why are they the first on the list, I wonder? Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, whatever, Donald Trump, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, George Bush, Dick Cheney, and many others. We condemn Benjamin Netanyahu in the strongest terms for his ongoing atrocities in Gaza, which amount to genocide and war crimes. His actions, enabled by U.S. support, demand immediate and uncompromising accountability. Ongoing U.S. support for genocide in Gaza and the long list of U.S. wars since World War II underscore the continuing relevance of Martin Luther King's observation that our country is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. So at least they said our country, they echoed Martin Luther King, that our country is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, not, for instance, Russia. Okay, so I'll give him credit for that. While we strongly condemn the actions of these leaders, we also recognize the importance of diplomacy, um, which you just undermined by calling the people that you advocate engaging in diplomacy with war criminals. The urgency of current global conflicts and the rising threat of nuclear war make dialogue essential, even with those who we believe have committed grave crimes. Um, this philosophy does not mean ignoring war crimes or human rights abuses. Rather, it acknowledges the necessity of engaging with adversaries like Putin to de escalate tensions and work toward peaceful resolutions. Um, why is Putin an adversary, Jill? Do you regard him as an adversary? I don't regard Vladimir Putin or Russia as adversaries. It's the U.S. ruling class that regards Putin and his government as adversaries. Um, in fact, a lot of governments that you support, or at least aren't calling their leaders war criminals, the U.S. regards as enemies. China, for example. Okay, so they say Netanyahu stands out among war criminals. Okay, but and the U.S. is the primary backer of Netanyahu, and of Israel. So, why does Netanyahu stand out in comparison to the U.S., without whose support Netanyahu couldn't be, or the Israel couldn't be committing genocide? Now, the U.S., as the primary backer of Netanyahu's military campaigns, holds the power to end his assault on Gaza and bring him to account. This is not a matter of diplomacy, but of the U.S. electorate exercising its responsibility by voting for leaders with a political will to act. As voters in the most powerful nation on earth, we bear a unique obligation to hold our government and its allies accountable. We must reiterate the paramount need for diplomacy, given the unprecedented threat of nuclear conflict today, with the war in Ukraine and the war in the Middle East, or genocide as well as war. To resolve these crises, we believe it is essential to end the U.S.-backed genocide in Gaza, the Israeli occupation of Palestine, and the longstanding ethnic cleansing and apartheid. The aspiration of the people of the Middle East to self-determination have long been suppressed by imperialist powers. This is why we opposed Putin's bombing of Syria that propped up Assad's regime. Okay, what? So what are you guys saying here? Are you saying Russia is an imperialist power? And what would be the alternative to Russia intervening in Syria to, quote unquote, prop up Assad's regime? Do you want ISIS and Al Qaeda or the likes of them to take over in Syria? Because that's what would have happened if Russia had not intervened in Syria. And you don't have to like Assad's government. I'm sure there's plenty of actual evidence, as opposed to propaganda, that's his government has engaged in human rights violations. But don't you think that these Islamo-fascists that the U.S. has supported ever since the 1980s with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, don't you think they'd be worse? I mean, come on. Just as we have opposed U.S. wars and interventions in Iraq, Afghanistan, and many other countries. So just putting Putin's intervention in Syria at the invitation of the Syrian government. They requested his help. You're putting that on par with the illegal U.S. interventions in Iraq, Afghanistan, etc., where in no case did the governments of those countries invite the U.S. to intervene. We are seeking the White House precisely to bring about the change that America and humanity so desperately need. Our campaign is committed to a foreign policy based on diplomacy, human rights, and international law. We advocate for the U.S. to take the lead on global nuclear disarmament efforts and to build a world where sovereignty and self-determination are respected, international is upheld, and war becomes a relic of the past. Only by addressing these issues with urgency and sincerity can we hope to reduce the risk of nuclear war and secure a future of peace, justice, and human rights for all. Okay, so I'm going to give some examples of various people's critical reactions to the Stein campaign statement. And then I'll continue with my own reactions, which I've been giving some of already. Okay, so, all right, well, I'm going to expand on what I said to her, so I won't read through mine. Ava Bartlett, who has extensive, she's a independent journalist, war correspondent who has extensively covered the wars in Syria and Ukraine. Hats off to her. She's been willing to risk her life in war zones for decades. So she says, uttering propaganda and cliches isn't a strategy of integrity. President Assad isn't a war criminal. He and the Syrian Arab Army and their allies defended Syrian civilians against the terrorist factions which Stein's government funded and armed in Syria. Ava Bartlett is from Canada, so that's why she says Stein's government. President Putin isn't a war criminal. He exercised immense restraint, constantly urging Ukraine to adhere to the Minsk agreements, which both Ukraine and its Western backers never intended to adhere to, we learned, and telling NATO to stop threatening Russia. He waited until the latest possible moment before finally launching the special military operation. Do some research, Stein. Your ignorance and ignorant Tulsi Gabbard-like statements do not flatter you. What she's referring to there are statements by Tulsi Gabbard to the effect that Bashar al-Assad is a brutal dictator, yada, yada, yada. Although, to be honest, at least at the time when she was in Congress and then running for president, Tulsi Gabbard's, demonstrated a lot more knowledge of the Syrian conflict than Jill Stein does here. She opposed, she talked about and opposed U.S. backing for ISIS and al-Qaeda associated terrorists in Syria that were trying to overthrow the Syrian government, and opposed the U.S. military intervening in Syria. You talked about how the troops put there by Donald Trump were, by his own admission, there to take Syria's oil, to steal Syria's oil. The U.S. is literally stealing oil from Syria. Not only preventing them from using it. And in addition, Tulsi Gabbard called out the propaganda regarding Syrian alleged Syrian chemical weapons attacks, which overwhelmingly the evidence suggests either did not occur, or if they did occur, they were perpetrated by the rebels, not the Syrian government, which engaged in internationally supervised destruction of his chemical weapons stock back in the early 2010s. George Galloway, you didn't have to do this. It is a mistake. If you don't run, they can't chase you. Scott Ritter, explain please how Vladimir Putin and Bashar al-Assad belong on this list. Can you articulate their crimes? by putting them on this list, you simply are playing the same game as those you ostensibly criticize. So she did articulate one of the alleged crimes, basically saying that civilians were killed as a result of the bombing campaign by Russia in Syria. But in general, I mean, if you've got the opportunity to issue a nuanced and detailed statement, why didn't you do it, Jill? Why didn't you do it? If you're going to talk about Putin and Assad being war criminals, you've got to spell out how you think they're war criminals, which we'll get to. What the evidence is regarding Syrian and Russian war crimes. Danny Haifong, the pressure has been intense from bad faith actors in the mainstream media, but lumping in Putin and Assad, two leaders in countries under direct attack from empire, with the very neocons conducting the attack, is a profound mistake. Deeply disappointed. The campaign was naturally picking up steam. I hope this is corrected soon. Kevork Almassian, a Syrian-born geopolitical analyst who grew up in Syria, left there in 2015 because he knew that the so-called moderate rebels in Syria, the ISIS and al-Qaeda affiliated groups trying to overthrow the Syrian government, were going to come for him. And in fact, they kidnapped his brother, who, as far as I know, is not political. But anyway, they kidnapped his brother and tried to get a ransom from their dad. Eventually, his brother was freed, and the whole family escaped to Germany, where he is now. But anyway, he says, I'm a Syrian journalist and the founder of the geopolitical platform Syriana Analysis. I've been covering and analyzing the Syrian war from its early stages. It would be amazing to have a dialogue with you about U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and Syria in particular. I am not trying to trap you like Mehdi Hasan did. Some journalists still have integrity. If you or your team see this comment, please follow me and I will DM you to arrange an online civilized conversation, which I haven't had a chance to watch it yet because it's paywalled and there's some sort of snafu with Substack getting 1 month subscription. But it sounds like that's exactly what Mehdi Hasan did. Based on the clips I've seen. Scott Ritter, Jill, delete this statement. Instead, come up with something like the article written by RFK Jr. and Donald Trump Jr. Tell us how you'll negotiate with Russia. Tell us how you'd prevent a nuclear war. That is the existence question of our time. Nothing else matters if we are not alive to make it matter. Okay, well, I was surprised to read this, as you might imagine, that Donald Trump's son was calling for negotiations with Moscow to end the Ukraine war. So let's have a look. Negotiate with Moscow to end the Ukraine war and prevent nuclear devastation by RFK Jr. and Donald Trump Jr. At a time when American leaders should be focused on finding a diplomatic off-ramp to a war that should never have been allowed to take place, the Biden-Harris administration is instead pursuing a policy that Russia says it will interpret as an act of war. In the words of Vladimir Putin, long-range strikes in Russia will mean that NATO countries, the United States and European countries, are at war with Russia. Some American analysts believe Putin is bluffing and favor calling his bluff. These analysts are mistaking restraint for weakness. In essence, they are advocating a strategy of brinksmanship. Each escalation draws the world closer to the brink of Armageddon. Their logic seems to be if you go to bear, that's Russia, 5 times and it doesn't respond, it's safe to go to him even harder a 6th time. Such a strategy might be reasonable if the bear had no teeth. The hawks in the Biden administration seem to have forgotten that Russia is a nuclear power. They have forgotten the wisdom of John F. Kennedy, who said in 1963, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. We should take this advice seriously. Putin has signaled numerous times that Russia would use nuclear weapons in extreme circumstances. Imagine if Russia were providing another country, like the U.S. is with Ukraine, with missiles, training, and targeting information to strike deep into American territory. The U.S. would never tolerate it. We shouldn't expect Russia to tolerate it either. This game of nuclear chicken has gone far enough. There's no remaining step between firing U.S. missiles deep into Russian territory and a nuclear exchange. We cannot get any closer to the brink than this. And for what? To weaken Russia? They're quoting Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin there, who said that the objective of the U.S. in its intervention in Ukraine, its proxy war against Russia, was to weaken Russia. To control Ukraine's minerals? No vital American interest is at stake. To risk nuclear conflict for the sake of the neoconservative fantasy of global full-spectrum dominance is madness. The war fever in the U.S. foreign policy establishment is at such a pitch that it's hard to tell whether they believe their own rhetoric. In last Tuesday's debate, Vice President Kamala Harris conjured up images of Russian forces rolling across Europe. Surely she must know how absurd that is. For one thing, Russia can barely wrest a few provinces from Ukraine, which is by no means one of Europe's great powers. Well, actually, they're wrong there as far as military prowess, at least at the beginning of the war. Ukraine had the second most powerful army in Europe. If you count Russia, which extends, of course, all the way to the eastern edge of Asia as part of Europe. First, if you don't count Russia, at least as far as conventional arms, because Ukraine doesn't have nuclear weapons, but most powerful army in Europe other than Russia's, but vastly less powerful than Russia. Secondly, Russia made its war aims very clear at the outset, most notably Ukrainian neutrality and a halt to NATO's eastward expansion. Hundreds of thousands of lost lives and hundreds of billions of dollars later, no one is better off. Not Europe, not America, and certainly not Ukraine. It is past time to de-escalate this conflict. This is more important than any of the political issues our nation argues about. Nuclear war would mean the end of civilization as we know it, maybe even the end of the human species. Former President Donald Trump has vowed to end this war, but by the time he takes office, it might be too late. We need to demand right now that Harris and President Biden reverse their insane war agenda and open direct negotiations with Moscow. So, remember who's writing this. RFK Jr. And Donald Trump Jr., who have insane views, meaning they have insane views of the Israel-Palestine conflict. They support Israel. They support the genocide. But here they are adopting a very measured and thoughtful tone toward the Ukraine conflict. Quite amazing that they actually put forth a better statement than Jill Stein did. Let's see. Let me play the banner here at the bottom. Someone asked me, Kevin Wayne asked me, are you familiar with Janice Courtcamp, U.S. housewife and activist, been to Syria at least 7 times? Obviously not as much as Medhurst, but she has a good perspective on Assad and the support he enjoys. That's interesting. I'll have to check that out, Kevin, if you could put a link to something she's said or done a video on or whatever in the comments. That would be awesome. But Yeah, you allude to an interesting fact about Assad, which is that by and large the Syrian people support him, because basically it's unlike U.S. elections, which, as I said last week, are a choice between two greater evils, really. Uh, Harris and Trump, in my view, are equally bad, just in different ways. They're virtually identical on foreign policy. Um, and you know, anyway, what I was saying, kind of lost my train of thought for a second there, is that Assad has a lot of popular support in Syria, uh, because of the religious freedom, because of Syria. It's basically a social democratic government. A lot of good social programs, but also, you know, his regime is what stands between them and a Islamo-fascist dictatorship like Saudi Arabia or the Gulf monarchies. Um, anyway, just wanted to respond to that comment before I forgot about it. Uh, Let me see if there are other comments I want to share with you here in response to Jill Stein's statement. Aaron Mate. Amazing to me that progressives repeat propaganda that even top U.S. officials have directly debunked. Aaron, by the way, is like Kibble for Almasian, quite knowledgeable about Syria. Has been there, at least once, and you testified at the UN regarding the lack of evidence for the uh, alleged Syrian gas attack on, I believe it was Duma, in 2018. So anyway, he says this Dr. Jill Stein statement claims that Russia's intervention in Syria was aimed at, quote, supporting Assad's brutal suppression of the Syrian people's uprising. Then Secretary of State John Kerry admitted that Russia intervened for a different reason. So what happened was that somebody secretly recorded a conversation between John Kerry, the Secretary of State under Barack Obama, following Hillary Clinton. Someone secretly recorded a conversation he had with Syrian opposition activists in September 2016. The reason Russia came in is because ISIS, was getting stronger, Kerry said. And that's why Russia came in, because they didn't want a Daesh, ISIL government, and they supported Assad. Syrian people did. So Russia intervened, Kerry admitted, because they didn't want an ISIL government. He also admitted that the U.S., as part of its multi-billion-dollar dirty war against Syria, one of the most expensive covert ops in U.S. history, was using ISIL as leverage for the U.S. goal of regime change. What Aaron's referring to there is Operation Timber Sycamore, which was, a covert U.S. operation to back what they labeled moderate rebels, but it was actually ISIL and Al Qaeda affiliated groups. To the tune of several $billions, and European countries also chipped in quite a lot. And I was listening to a interview with Kevork Almasian earlier today, and he said that the total amount of funding, including both Project Timber Sycamore and the U.S. military intervening directly, and European funding, and so on and so forth, amounted to about a $200 billion effort to try and overthrow the Syrian government. Daesh, ISIL was threatening the possibility of going to Damascus and so forth, and we know that this was growing. We were watching. We saw that Daesh was growing in strength, and we thought Assad was threatened. We thought, however, we could probably manage that Assad would then negotiate his way out of power. That's continuance of the quote, continuation of the quote from John Kerry. By that point, the other dominant force in Syria's insurgency was al-Qaeda, which the U.S. also allied with in its push for regime change. That is why Jake Sullivan wrote in 2012, al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria. This is some of the vital factual record that Mehdi Hasan omitted in his attempted gotcha with Jill Stein, which prompted her statement. Okay, let's see who else who knows more about Syria than apparently Jill Stein does had to say about these comments. Ajamu Baraka, Jill Stein's running mate in 2016, also was very critical of this statement. He said, this is a position to the right of our positions in 2016. Why? People were naturally turning to the campaign as a viable alternative. Playing to the rightist forces among the left and Democratic Party was not necessary. So I'd love to hear more from him about his views. He doesn't really go into specifics here, but basically just says he thought this was a bad statement. Who else we got? Aaron Good, geopolitical commentator who authored the book American Exception, Empire and the Deep State, had this to say: I like Stein, but I don't like when people on the left indulge this compulsion to condemn the West's selected enemies for alleged violations of international law, when said violations are undertaken, if they actually occurred, that is, in response to existentially threatening actions of the U.S. empire. Putin invaded sovereign, quote-unquote, Ukraine after the U.S. staged a blatantly obvious Nazi-abetted coup to install a puppet regime in order to damage Russian national security by turning Ukraine into a de facto NATO beachhead right on Moscow's doorstep. Assad allegedly did not do enough to minimize civilian casualties while fighting the army of head-chopping muck jihadists that the U.S. sent in to overthrow the Syrian government. And he allegedly used chemical weapons, except it seems pretty clear that these alleged chemical attacks were staged by Western proxies. So the first of these chemical attacks, the first couple back in, I believe it was 2013, the beginning of Obama's second term, and also the first congressional term of Tulsi Gabbard, who was one of the leading opponents, and one of the very few opponents of the U.S. intervention in Syria, who was consistent about it throughout the years, other than the concession to the claim that Assad was a brutal dictator, but otherwise, she consistently opposed U.S. intervention. Anyway, there were two chemical actual chemical attacks in 2013. The second one killed over 1,000 people. But the evidence strongly suggests that these were perpetrated not by the Syrian government, but these alleged moderate rebels. Who is Stein trying to appeal to with these SAPs or SOPs? He says the nerdbag left is a negligible percentage of the electorate. If we want to protest righteously, let's stop pandering to liberals and fake leftists who accept fundamental tenets of U.S. imperial cosmology. I don't believe anyone in the West has any business condemning the West's chosen enemies. Syria is an exceptionalist regime because it faces existential threats. The U.S. is in a permanent state of exception, quote unquote, committing crimes around the world because it pursues global empire. So, it's a question of scale and of context. So, if you look at the nature of the Russian and Syria's governments and economies, Russia, it's a capitalist country. It has a ruling class, an oligarchic class, but not an imperialist country. They don't have uh, control over. They don't dominate country after country in the global South the way the U.S. does. As I mentioned before, they only have two military bases that aren't in what used to be Russia proper. Now one of them is the one in Crimea. Russia's alliances, just as was the case when the Soviet Union existed, are overwhelmingly with countries in the global South. They include all the countries that are indisputably anti-imperialist, such as China, Venezuela, Vietnam, Cuba, South Africa, North Korea, etc. And Syria is also part of that anti-imperialist camp. And mind you, when we say that a country is fighting Western imperialism, that could very well be the case, even in spite of it having a bad government. So let's assume, for the sake of argument, that Russia and Syria are very repressive and autocratic regimes, and you know they've got a ruling class that exploits the hell out of the rest of the population, and so on and so forth. Even so, that they are still, allied with countries that are fighting against Western imperialism. So, again, what I think is primarily wrong with Stein et al.'s statement is that it doesn't provide the key context that Assad's and Putin's governments are not only part of this alliance with formerly colonized countries, Syria, of course, being one of them, but they're victims of the West's attempts to undermine their country's governments. The U.S. has long had, as an openly declared objective, destabilizing and dismembering Russia. So you might recall, or you might be aware of the fact that the U.S. basically rigged Russia's 1996 presidential election to make sure that Boris Yeltsin, who was the U.S.'s puppet, was reelected. Under Yeltsin's administration, in the 1990s, Russia became basically a vassal state of Western imperialism. It was just, open season for Western multinational corporations and oligarchs to invest in Russia and take control of Russian resources. And Russia under Yeltsin did all the usual things that countries do when they're under the thumb of the IMF and the World Bank, cutting social programs to the bone, and so on and so forth. Under this pro-Western administration that the U.S. made sure stayed in power throughout the 1990s, Russia's economy totally crashed. Their life expectancy declined by some absurd amount in a matter of just a few years. And widespread poverty and so on and so forth. And say what you will about Putin, there are all kinds of problems with Russian society, such as the lack of tolerance of gay and lesbian people and so forth. But you know, Putin's government, to a significant degree, reined in the Russian oligarchs, nationalized some key sectors of the economy, um, and much as Venezuela has done, um, and put Russia on the road to economic recovery and ultimately prosperity. Um, but anyway, that's kind of going off on a tangent there. And, the U.S. not only rigged Russia's 1996 presidential election. You can find a cover of Time magazine that openly admits this, published in 1996. The U.S. was constantly fomenting color revolutions in countries surrounding Russia, um, most notably, of course, in Ukraine, where there was a coup, U.S.-backed coup in 2004 that deposed a um, Russia-friendly president. And then in 2014, that coup deposed the very same, um, not, I wouldn't say pro-Russian, but Russia-friendly and West-friendly president. He was deposed in the 2014 coup that brought a far-right anti-Russian government to power, which is a government Ukraine has continued to have under Zelensky, even though Zelensky is ethnic Russian himself. I mean, Zelensky is basically a dictator now. He's canceled elections. His political opponents are sent to prison, often tortured. The free press has been abolished. Opposition political parties have been abolished. That's what Ukraine is today. That's not what Russia is, despite the claims that Putin's a dictator and all that. Yeah, and even if, let's grant for the sake of argument that some of the war crimes charges against Putin and Assad are true. For example, it could be argued that bombing or shelling in Syria was sometimes done in a careless manner that inflicted civilian casualties that could have been avoided while still achieving their military objectives of defeating the forces trying to overthrow Syria's government. Yeah, of course, any deliberate or careless killing of civilians should be condemned. But you Stein's statement lacked the broader context that it needed. First of all, the war crimes of Westerners such as Netanyahu, Biden, and Bush are far more severe than those of Assad and Putin. To the extent that they exist. Um, and she did kind of concede that later on in the statement, but this featuring of the claim that Putin and Assad are war criminals in the first part of the statement really kind of goes counter to that. And the second aspect of the political context that the Stein campaign's statement omits is that Syria and Russia wouldn't be involved in wars in the first place, and therefore wouldn't be it wouldn't be possible for them to be committing war crimes if the West weren't trying to overthrow their governments. Don't believe me? That oh, let's see. If you don't believe me, um, that's what's going on here. Have a look at this. Where is it? I thought I had it open. Guess not. There's a famous think tank in the United States called the Rand Corporation, uh, where part of the Pentagon Papers were which were leaked in the 1970s came from the Rand Corporation. Uh, they issued a policy document in, I believe, 2019 that outlined very clearly that the goal of U.S. foreign policy is to overextend and destabilize Russia and overthrow their government. And just right out in the open. Okay, so here are some highlights from it. Overextending and unbalancing Russia, assessing the impact of cost-imposing options. The infamous Rand Corporation has created a study calling for the breakup of Russia. The plan is now being implemented by the US, UK, NATO. So they want to get their hands on Russia's abundant natural resources, the greatest treasure trove of natural resources in the world. And of course, you have many other statements from U.S. officials, such as Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin or Senator Lindsey Graham, basically acknowledging they want to weaken Russia or even overthrow Russia. Okay, so I mean, and that doesn't mean that we uh, should refrain from condemning any actual war crimes that have taken place on the part of Syria or Russia or whoever it is. But we've got to include that context. I mean, if you look historically at slave rebellions or uprisings against colonialism, or if you look at the current uprising against Israel's colonial occupation by Hamas and affiliated groups, yeah, sure, you can find examples of atrocities committed by the rebels. Nat Turner and his gang of slaves trying to uh, fight against slavery and free themselves from slavery, they killed entire slave-owning families. Not just the master, but the entire family, including babies. In various colonial rebellions in Africa, India, Algeria, India, South Africa, and now Israel. There have also been atrocities committed against civilians, or I should have said Palestine, not Israel. They were quite. There were quite a lot of them in some of these cases in Algeria and India, for instance. Okay, sure. We should always say it's not okay to kill or harm innocent civilians. But if you solely condemn atrocities against civilians that were perpetrated by rebelling slaves or by colonized people trying to gain their freedom and ignore what their objective is, to free themselves, that's not appropriate. And I don't think that it's any more appropriate to do what Jill Stein's statement did and ignore the context that there's a threat to Russian and Syrian sovereignty by the West. And when you look at the specific allegations of atrocities against Syria and against Russia, quite a few of them don't hold up to scrutiny. So, for example, okay, well, I already covered the chemical weapons attacks allegedly by the Syrian government, which didn't even have any chemical weapons with which to attack anybody after about 2014, I believe it was. Yeah. Yeah, obviously that's bogus. It's been thoroughly refuted. Uh, the organization for the uh, OPCW, is that it? Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, which is affiliated with the UN, initially issued a report refuting the claims of the chemical weapons attack on Duma being perpetrated by um, the Syrian government. Basically, they didn't find any evidence that a chemical weapon attack took place. And then, because lots of institutions associated with the UN, such as the International Criminal Court, are corrupted by Western influence, the OPCW being one of them, they basically um, didn't release that report and issued a new report that was more unamenable to the Western propaganda narrative. But basically, they said, yeah, there wasn't a chemical weapons attack in Duma. Uh, the Syrian government didn't have any chemical weapons. As far as uh, claims about uh, Russian war crimes, well, of course, the number one allegation against Russia is just the fact of the invasion of Ukraine itself. Now, I've written extensively about that in an article I published on my Substack a couple of years ago. Let's see, do I have it called up? No. But just in a nutshell, um, there was a long lead up to Russian intervention in Ukraine, where, as a couple of the commentators I've already showed you uh, posts on X by, um, Russia really made a concerted effort to try and settle the Ukraine civil war peacefully and try to negotiate with the West to prevent them from, for example, putting nuclear missiles in Eastern Europe. We would never allow allies of Russia, if Russia had any allies in countries bordering the U.S. Well, I mean, Cuba is an ally. Obviously, we didn't tolerate Russia putting nuclear missiles in Cuba in the early 60s, and we wouldn't today tolerate them putting nuclear missiles in Mexico or Canada or whoever. So why would we expect Russia to put up with it, or even putting long-range missiles, conventional missiles, capable of reaching Moscow in Ukraine? It's perfectly understandable that Russia does not want to tolerate that. But it's been alleged that the Russian invasion of Ukraine was illegal. But Scott Ritter makes a case in this article that in fact there was a legal basis for Russian intervention in Ukraine. Ritter says, when it comes to illegal use of force between states, it is considered unimpeachable fact that in accordance with the intent of the United Nations Charter to ban all conflict, there are only two acceptable exceptions. One is an enforcement action to maintain international peace and security authorized by a Security Council resolution passed under Chapter 7 of the Charter, which permits the use of force. The other is the inherent right of individual and collective self-defense, as enshrined in Article 51 of the UN Charter, which reads as follows. Nothing in the present charter shall impair the inherent right of individual or collective self-defense if an armed attack occurs against a member of the United Nations until the Security Council has taken measures necessary to maintain international peace and security. Measures taken by members in this exercise of this right of self-defense shall be immediately reported to the Security Council and shall not in any way affect the authority and responsibility of the Security Council under the present charter to take at any time such action as it deems necessary in order to maintain or restore international peace and security. So A plain language reading of Article 51, he goes on to say, makes it clear that the trigger necessary for invocation of the right of self-defense is the occurrence of actual armed attack. The notion of an open-ended threat to security does not by itself suffice. Okay, so okay, what I'm looking for is him talking about the justification that NATO used for its intervention in Yugoslavia. Okay, so basically, the U.S. and other NATO countries use the collective self-defense clause of Article 51 of the UN Charter to justify its intervention in Yugoslavia, where they bombed Kosovo and Serbia, because they claimed that uh, the Serbian government under President Milosevic was committing genocide. So they were, intervening to prevent that. Um, Now, irrespective of whether there was actual evidence that that was happening, which it appears there isn't, the point is that uh, under the UN Charter, there's a right for uh, countries' allies to intervene to help them defend themselves against an attack if you know um, they request that help. Okay, so what does that have to do with Russia's intervention in Ukraine? Basically, what happened in the lead up to the Ukraine or to Russia's intervention in Ukraine is okay. So there was a long civil war dating back to 2014, where the Kiev regime, um, first the Poroshenko regime and then the Zelensky regime, was uh, engaging in shelling and bombing, missile attacks, and so forth against the eastern Ukrainian provinces of Donetsk and Luhansk. Um, Now, of course, at that time, uh, Donetsk and Luhansk were part of Ukraine. So, under Article 51, Russia could not legally, under the UN Charter, intervene in Ukraine because, obviously the Ukrainian government, which was committing these war crimes against predominantly ethnic Russian civilians in eastern Ukraine, killing several thousand of them over the course of uh, 8 years, 2014 to 2022, when Russia intervened. But what if Donetsk and Luhansk declared independence from Ukraine? Which, I mean, they were already lobbying for autonomy. And Crimea, of course, which already had autonomy, voted to secede from Ukraine and join Russia in 2014 as a result of the actions of the neo-Nazis in places like Odessa, where they burned dozens of people to death that were in opposition to the coup government. So, you know, in Donetsk and Luhansk as well. They didn't declare independence from Ukraine, but they voted in 2014 to basically seek autonomy. Let me call up the specifics here in the article that I wrote. Okay, let me just actually review some of what took place after the coup. Among the first actions of the coup government, this is from my article, The Ukraine Tragedy Made in America, which you can find on my Substack blog. Among the first actions of the coup government were to ban the Ukrainian Communist Party and other left wing parties and to attack the language rights of the Russian minority. For example, education could no longer be conducted in Russian, in predominantly ethnic Russian parts of Ukraine. Getting kind of hot in here, so I'll turn on the AC. Protests against the coup broke out in cities around the country, particularly in the predominantly Russian eastern and southeastern regions, where polls indicated the overwhelming majority of the population opposed the Maidan, quote, revolution, the coup that took place in, or was centered around Maidan Square in Kiev. These protests were violently attacked by the fascists. A particularly egregious attack occurred in Odessa, where an assault on coup protesters resulted in 48 people being burned alive after being locked in a labor union building. Unfortunately, in a number of cities such as Mariupol and Odessa, fascists wound up having de facto control. However, in Crimea and in much of the Donbass region, the protests were more successful, and the people had had enough of the coup government and its anti-Russian bigotry. In an overwhelming vote, the people of the Donbass region backed the formation of the independent Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. And by a likewise overwhelming margin, the people of Crimea voted to rejoin Russia, which Crimea had been part of until 1954. Okay, so by a margin of, by a 96% vote, people in Crimea voted to join Russia, secede from Ukraine, join Russia. And the people of Donetsk and Luhansk, 89% yes vote in Donetsk, 96% in Luhansk, voted to secede from Ukraine. So as a result of their opposition to the coup government, Donetsk and Luhansk were attacked by the Ukrainian military for 8 years, resulting in thousands of people dying. Crimea was, pretty invulnerable because it was part of Russia, had a Russian military base there, naval base in Sevastopol. So at the time, Ukraine didn't try to mess with them. But they did, well, actually, they did engage in some shenanigans against Crimea. They dammed the canal that supplied the majority of Crimea's water. But anyway, okay, I'm sorry. I think I made the point I was trying to make. That basically, Donetsk and Luhansk voted to secede from Ukraine. Okay, where are you, Scott? Okay, so as independent states, according to their own self-declaration, Donetsk and Luhansk could request Russian intervention. All they needed was for the Russian government to recognize them as independent nations, which Russia eventually did. So basically, what happened was, although there was a period where the Civil War was pretty low intensity, in the late 2010s and early 2020s, by 2022, the attacks on Donetsk and Luhansk greatly escalated. They were being shelled constantly, and according to intelligence leaks that Russia obtained, the Ukrainian troops, which they could see with their satellite imagery, were gathering on something like 80,000 Ukrainian troops were gathered on the border of Donetsk and Luhansk. And so I forget if it was, I think it was the Donetsk People's Republic government received intelligence indicating that Ukraine was about to, the Kiev regime was about to invade the Donbass, Donetsk and Luhansk. Okay, so Scott goes on to say, Russia claims to have documentary proof that the Ukrainian army was preparing for a massive military incursion into the Donbass, which was preempted by the Russian-led special military operation. Okay, so basically what Scott is saying here is that under Article 51 of the UN Charter, the collective self-defense part of it, Russia had a legal right to intervene in Ukraine because they were invited by the governments of Donetsk and Luhansk, which had declared their independence from Ukraine, and which Russia, shortly before its invasion, recognized the independence of. Russia had a legal case for intervening to help Donetsk and Luhansk fend off the impending Ukrainian invasion, because they requested Russia's help. Okay, so I did. Kevin Wayne writes further. Did you see the links I just posted for Janice? No, I don't see them here actually. So if you could post them again, or if you could send them to me on Twitter or X. I'm at Lefty Vegan on X. I'd really appreciate that. I'd like to check that out. So anyway, where was I? Okay, so the invasion itself, according to Scott Ritter's analysis, had a legal basis because Donetsk and Luhansk had declared for their independence from Ukraine. Russia recognized it. They requested Russia's help in fighting off the Ukrainian military. So that's the legal basis for the invasion. And of course, there were lots and lots of allegations by Ukraine and the West about various specific Russian war crimes. One of which resulted in an international criminal court case against, they've charged Vladimir Putin with war crimes. And basically, the claim is that Russia supposedly kidnapped Ukrainian children and took them to camps in Russia. Okay, here's a long article from the Gray Zone, which I'll just mention a few things from. ICC's Putin arrest warrant based on State Department-funded report that debunked itself. So, summary of the key points of the article. The International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Russian President Vladimir Putin, accusing him of the unlawful deportation of Ukrainian children to a network of camps inside Russia. The warrant was based on a report by the Yale Human Rights Law Center, which is funded by the U.S. State Department. U.S. journalist Jeremy Lafredo, one of the co-authors of this article, along with Max Blumenthal, the founder of the Gray Zone, visited one of the Russian government-sponsored camps in question. At the Donbass Express camp, located just outside of Moscow, Lafredo met youth from war-torn regions who were flourishing thanks to free music instruction and grateful to be in a secure environment. So the claim is, the basis of the ICC's charges and arrest warrant against Putin is that supposedly the Russian government kidnapped Ukrainian kids and took them to Moscow. But in reality, according to the Russian government and confirmed by Lafredo in his visit, basically what Russia was doing was evacuating not only kids but adults from a war zone. And in addition, giving them opportunities to get some free education, including music instruction, which they couldn't get in their home residence in the Donbass, in Donetsk or Luhansk, because it was a war zone. It wasn't secure. It wasn't safe. A Gray Zone review of the Yale HRL report found that the paper's content contradicted many claims contained in the International Criminal Court warrant. It also undercut incendiary statements its director, Nathaniel Raymond, issued during media appearances. In an interview with Lafredo, Yale Human Rights Law's Raymond further contradicted allegations he made in a CNN interview about a massive, quote, hostage situation underway in Russia, acknowledging that most of the camps he researched were teddy bear-like cultural programs. He also disclosed his collaboration with U.S. intelligence. Okay, so this arrest warrant accused Putin and the Commissioner for Children's Rights, Maria Yova-Belova, I hope I got that pronunciation correct, of conducting the unlawful deportation of Ukrainian children to a, quote, network of camps across the Russian Federation, and that inspired a wave of incendiary commentary in the West. U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham, perhaps the most aggressive cheerleader in Congress for war with Russia, proclaimed, the ICC has an arrest warrant for Putin because he has organized the kidnapping of at least 16,000 Ukrainian children from their families and sent them to Russia. It is exactly what Hitler did in World War II. CNN's Fareed Zakaria echoed Graham, declaring the ICC warrant revealed that Putin is, in fact, following parts of Hitler's playbook. So they're really laying on the propaganda thick here. During an interview with CNN's Anderson Cooper, Yale Human Rights Law's executive director, Raymond, claimed that his report provided proof that thousands of children are in a hostage situation. Invoking the Holocaust, Raymond asserted, we are dealing with the largest network of children camps seen in the 21st century. Children camps. It doesn't seem like he speaks very good English. Yet in an interview with Jeremy Lafredo, the co-author of this report, and in his own paper for Yale Human Rights Law, Raymond contradicted many of the bombastic claims he made to CNN and other media about child hostages. During a phone conversation with Lafredo, Raymond acknowledged that a large amount of the camps his team investigated were primarily cultural education. Yale HRL's report similarly acknowledges that most of the camps it profiled provided free recreational programs for disadvantaged youth whose parents sought to protect children from ongoing fighting and ensure they had nutritious food of the sort unavailable where they live. All the campers returned home in a timely manner after attending with the consent of their parents, according to the paper. He didn't even, he misrepresented the contents of his own report. in the interviews that he did, claiming that they were kidnapped and so forth. And that in turn led to the ICC's arrest warrants issued against Putin and his government official. I forget her name. Unlike the Yale investigators who inspired the ICC's arrest warrant, Lafredo gained unfettered access to a Russian government camp in Moscow that houses youth from the war-torn Donbass region. Okay, so in case you didn't catch that, since I'm not reading you the whole article, this Yale human rights law outfit didn't even visit these camps. They didn't even go to them. And yet they were making all kinds of claims about what was going on. Some of which went, at least in Raymond's interviews with the media, went well beyond what the report actually said. Though it is precisely the kind of center that Yale HRL and by extension the ICC have portrayed as a re-education camp for Ukrainian child hostages, Lafredo, the co-author of this article, found a hotel full of happy campers receiving free classical music lessons in their native Russian language. Again, Donetsk and Luhansk are predominantly ethnic Russian, Russian speaking, from first-class instructors. At the Donbass Express music camp located just outside of Moscow, youth told Lafredo that they were grateful to have found refuge from the Ukrainian army's years-long campaign of shelling and besiegement of their homeland. By fleeing the war in Donbass, these children had escaped a nightmarish military conflict for which Yale HRL and the ICC have demonstrated little to no concern. And again, these were young students who had been studying music in Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine, which later became part of Russia, and they couldn't pursue their studies in the Donbass because it was too dangerous. So they did so at this music camp in the Moscow area. By the time of my visit, Lafredo says, the Russian government had transformed the hotel where the campers were staying into a makeshift sleepaway camp for children native to the breakaway republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. So at first they just evacuated the kids, with the consent of their parents, if they weren't orphaned, which there are a lot of in that region. And then they set up this music camp. Parents who wished to keep their families protected from the conflict back home had enrolled their children in the program. For much of their lives, these youths lived with a threat of death on a daily basis. For the 8 years leading up to Russia's February 2022 invasion of Ukraine, the ethnically Russian population of Donbass endured regular shelling at the hands of the U.S.-backed nationalist government in Kiev. Even before February 2022, that civil conflict had left thousands of civilians, including children like the ones I met at the Donbass Express, dead. Although the State Department-funded Yale report would have Americans believe that Russia's move to open camps such as the Donbass Express amounted to war crimes, the students I met there did not want to leave. I spoke with 2 Donbass Express students on camera. Each expressed effusive gratitude for the program. I am here on invitation, on generous invitation, said one from Donetsk. I never thought I would get to come to Moscow. I've been helping to perform in concerts, which is helpful for spiritual enrichment and soul purification, and I'm here to develop my musical performing skills. Another kid from the Donbass told me, here we continue our musical studies despite what has been going on around us because it gives us relief. Like all other students in the program, these aspiring musicians grew up in a region in open rebellion against the Ukrainian government that has banned their Russian Orthodox religious denomination. I forgot to mention that earlier. Sought to outlaw the Russian language, not allowing it to be taught in schools or to be on street signs and so forth, and violently attacked the ethnic Russian population of the country. Okay, let's see if there's anything else I want to mention. Okay, so this whole ICC charge against Putin, uh, basically, it's based on propaganda that was initiated by this Yale you know, department, and then exaggerated by Raymond's reports from the media. Okay, let's see. Just one other detail about war crimes allegations that I wanted to cover, just very briefly, and that's the claim that there was a massacre of civilians in Bucha or Buka, Ukraine, a town near Kiev, and basically, the problem with the claim is that we know exactly when Russian soldiers left the town of Bucha that they had been occupying, and we have a pretty good idea of when people were killed. So I forget his name now. Somebody put it in the comments if you think of it. But the guy who runs the blog Moon of Alabama wrote this article about the alleged Bucha massacre, titled U.S. Military Intelligence Official Refutes Russian Atrocities Claims. Russian soldiers left the town Bucha in Ukraine on March 30th. 2 days later, the Ukrainian Gestapo-like SBU and men of the fascist Azov battalion moved in to find and remove traitors. That's like paraphrasing exactly what they said was their motivation for coming in. They were trying to catch traitors and kill them. On April 2nd and 3rd, video was published that showed freshly killed men lying on the streets of Bucha. Several of them had white armbands signaling to Russian forces to see them as friendlies. So basically what happened here is that these residents of Bucha wore white armbands to let Russian forces know that they were, not hostile to them. But those very same white armbands told the Ukrainian military and intelligence services that they were pro-Russian. The West and Ukrainian officials immediately called those dead the result of Russian atrocities. The former Indian ambassador to Ukraine, Bhadra Kumar, called these claims fake. And a fake it was. The person who runs this blog wrote, "Thankfully, there are still some sane U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency officials, and William Arkin is talking with them." Last Wednesday, Bucha Mayor Anatoly Fedoruk said that 320 people have been killed in Bucha. It is ugly, a senior official with the Defense Intelligence Agency tells Newsweek. But we forget that two peer competitors fought over Bucha for 36 days, the Russian and Ukrainian military, and that the town was occupied, that Russian convoys and positions inside the town were attacked by the Ukrainians and vice versa. Ground combat was intense. The town itself was literally fought over. I am not for a second excusing Russia's war crimes nor forgetting that Russia invaded the country, says the DIA official, but the number of actual deaths is hardly genocide. If Russia had that objective or was intentionally killing civilians, we'd see a lot more than less than 0.01% having been killed in places like Bucha. The DIA official continues, have the Russians been indiscriminate? Absolutely, but it shouldn't be too surprising. It's part and parcel of the Russian way of war. So, he's basically, spouting the U.S. Narrative there. But here in particular, in Bucha and other towns around it, there was intense ground fighting that involved almost 20 battalion tactical groups. So he says, I doubt that there's really intentional, indiscriminate Russian artillery fire. The Russians have held back quite a lot and paid in blood for it. One should also note that the often shown mass graves in Bucha were not from recent actions, but had been dug on March 10th after heavy fighting when Russian soldiers tried to enter the town. Now, the DIA official clearly says that civilian casualties in Ukraine, which are quite low compared to the size of the town, get overplayed, and that attributing them solely to Russia is wrong. On Monday, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights said it had recorded 1,793 deaths and 2,439 injuries to civilians in all of Ukraine since the war began on February 24th. And this was written 2 months later, April of 2022. U.S. intelligence believes that the true number is some 5 times greater, as previously reported by Newsweek. It's bad, the DIA official says, and I don't want to say it's not too bad, but I can't help but stress that beyond the clamor, we're not seeing the war clearly. Where there's been intense ground fighting and a standoff between Ukrainian and Russian forces, the destruction is almost total. But in terms of actual damage in Kiev or other cities outside the battle zone, and with regard to the number of civilian casualties overall, the evidence contradicts the dominant narrative. And I should add that remains true today, where last I heard, the estimated number of civilian casualties in Ukraine over the course of the 2.5 years of the Ukraine war, following the Russian invasion, is in the neighborhood of 10,000, whereas the number of military casualties is something like 60 or 70,000 on the Russian side, and I'm saying casualties, but I should say deaths, and about 400,000 or 500,000 Ukrainian soldiers killed. So that's actually, as terrible as it is that all those soldiers lost their lives, in comparison, the number of civilian deaths is extremely low, compared to what you find in other wars. Obviously, way, way, way lower than what you find in Gaza. And he goes on to say, if we blame all the damage on Putin as if he commanded it and that it is due solely to Russian war crimes, we're going to walk away from Ukraine with some illusion in our heads that modern warfare can be fought more cleanly than that the Ukraine war is an anomaly solely created by Russia's behavior. This war is demonstrating how destructive any war on this scale would be. One should avoid waging war whenever possible, but it is also important to end wars as quickly as possible. Maybe it's heartless, he says to the DIA official, says to urge that we look at Ukraine with precision without human emotion. But for those who think tens of thousands have died and Russia is intentionally killing civilians and pursuing genocide, I'd say that's even more of an argument to find a diplomatic solution to cease fighting. But nothing is going to happen in the coming days or weeks to change the reality on the battlefield. That's why stopping the fighting should be our highest priority. So anyway, this is one of many articles in independent media outlets I've come across that basically say the notion that Russia committed these mass civilian atrocities in Bucha, that they massacred 300 people intentionally, who were not part of the Ukrainian military. There just isn't evidence that that's what happened. And what would be the motive? Unlike Israel, where basically almost the entire society hates Palestinians and wants to kill or expel them all, Russia does not have Russians don't have an unfavorable attitude toward Ukrainians. There's no reason why they would deliberately massacre civilians. There's just not the motivation there. Whereas you take U.S. soldiers in Vietnam, they were taught to hate so-called gooks, the Vietnamese, or in Iraq, very negative sentiment toward the people in Iraq on the part of a lot of people in the U.S. military, and certainly that was very much the sentiment bandied about by U.S. politicians and the media. Not so in this case. So anyway. My point is that you just can't trust Western liberals, whether it's Mehdi Hasan or human rights groups like Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch. You can't trust them when they say that official enemies of the United States, like Russia or Syria or whoever it is, committed war crimes or crimes against humanity. Certainly, it does happen. Nobody would claim, given that we have video evidence of it, that there hasn't been repression in Iran, for instance, of women demonstrating against being required to wear hijab. But a lot of allegations of these sorts of crimes, such as the Bucha massacre, such as the Syrian gas attacks, etc., turn out to be false. There just isn't evidence to back them, but they're repeated so often, like weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and so on and so forth, that they become accepted as fact. And if you say, well, look, the evidence says they're not true, you get called a Putin puppet or Assad sympathizer, or whatever it is. But I mean, it's only reasonable that when somebody like Mehdi Hasan or the U.S. politicians or mainstream media commentators say that Putin or Assad or whoever who's considered an official enemy considered an enemy by the U.S. government is a massive war criminal, we ought to be skeptical. We ought to say, okay, where's the evidence for that? And I'm sorry, but I don't see that healthy skepticism being exhibited by Jill or the authors of this statement. And as I pointed out, her running mate in 2016 agrees with that. Says you shouldn't have issued this statement. It isn't going to help you. It's just capitulating to pressure from folks who otherwise just don't share your political perspective. Now, all that said, I think it's important to maintain a united front against the Gaza genocide and against imperialism and capitalism generally. So I'm going to continue supporting Jill Stein, even though here in Indiana I can't vote for her, despite my feeling that this statement was quite off base in its tenor. It lacked nuance, it lacked contextualization, and I feel that that is essential. If you're issuing a written statement that you have all the time in the world to write, as opposed to responding to badgering from a hostile interviewer like Mehdi Hasan. I think it's important for the growth of our movement, for peace, social justice, etc., to have a stronger third party. And at least for the moment, the left-leaning third party that has the best chance for growth, well, not just left-leaning, but explicitly socialist according to its uh, principles. The party that has the best chance for growth here in the United States is the Green Party. So I want to support them. And I think it was really important that after Cornel West stepped down, that the Green Party found another candidate with a similar potential for popular appeal. And they found it in Jill Stein. So I'm not saying that all of a sudden I hate Jill Stein or something. Far from it. I think that in general, she's a good candidate and a great person. But yeah, they got to do something about this statement because it's really um, not something they should have written in that way. Okay, well, um, where'd my what happened to my picture here? Hmm. I don't know if anybody can hear me, but my uh, my StreamYard screen seems to be frozen. It's not showing a picture of me. Um, I've got the spinning ball of death here. So I'm going to end the stream here. Hopefully you can hear me. And I will see you next time.